Well, hello everybody. We are again here talking about one of the iconic figures of the 20th century spirituality, J. Krishnamurti. In the first lecture last time, over a month ago, I explored mostly Krishnamurti's teaching, his emphasis on observation, and what he meant by self-observation, which turned out has different degrees of subtlety, and the fullness of it is something actually many people find difficult to practice. Because for him, observation, first of all, is in the moment, is observing just what is here now, what he calls the fact, which basically turned out to be an observation without an observer. And observation without the observer will mean because what you're observing is something in you, part of you, and the observer is also part of you. But then it gets subtler into that I emphasized last time, the two kinds of observation without an observer, which he ended up calling the observer is the observed. And that one kind is one, he or is one with what he observes, what he calls one with the fact, a unity with what is observed, whether what's observed is a bird, is an emotion, a thought, and the other one is just the fact, just the observed without anyone being there or being one with it or observing it, or just the fact there on its own, which is a very unusual kind of realization. I brought those two kinds because I thought that it clarifies his teaching some and his experience, what he means by observation, which is an intensity with passion, but also no mind, with no memory, no thought. So the observation for him is observation without an observer, without the effect of memories or thoughts or time, which means totally in the moment, totally in stillness, and then one can see what is there completely for what it is. And then even the seer is gone. So that's what I talked about last time. I want to go on now to other kind of experiences that he talked about and that are more discernible when you read his own diaries and what is reported in his biographies than thing he talked about in the teaching. Yeah, some of them are more commonly known, and the more we go into it, I'm putting them in a progression from the most commonly known, the less commonly known kind of spiritual experiences or realization. And we will see how the idea, his way of experiencing, which is the observer is the observed, or observation without an observer, which are two kinds I mentioned, how that's reflected not into observing nature or person or thought, but into more explicit spiritual manifestation that I didn't discuss last time, because I was talking about his observation of nature, people, cars, stuff like that. But now the experiences I'm going to be talking about are more of inner, more what people usually call spiritual experience. So I divided them into two parts, going into degrees of subtlety or degrees of more uncommon and more characteristic of Krishnamurti, and why he is an enigmatic kind of character, enigmatic spiritual, spiritual personality. So I don't usually use notes for when I talk, but for this kind of thing, I'm using notes because much of it is quotations. I'm reading quotes from his writings, all from some of his biographers. And it is complex what I'm going to be getting into. I'm not going to just give a quote about what his experiences, but try to understand them, understand what goes with them, how he developed, what's it about. So hopefully we'll get some understanding of Krishnamurti, which is, I think, is interesting because I haven't really read anywhere anybody who tried to fully understand him, especially that he himself said he didn't understand himself and wanted others to understand him and tell him if they did. We'll see that in some of the quote. First quotation. In the car on the way to Ojai, that's in California, where place they bought for him, Southern California. And in the car on the way to Ojai, again it began. The pressure and the feeling of immense vastness. One was not experiencing this vastness. It was simply there. So the first thing, one means himself. He doesn't say I, he says one or he. So this is an example of just the thing itself, the fact itself. There's no one being one with it. He said it was simply there. But we see here he brings in the pressure that he feels as those experiences happen, the pressure that he calls at some point his process, which includes pain of different kinds, which I will discuss in further quotation. Another quote. There is no interpreter to translate, to observe, to censor. An immeasurable vastness that is utterly still and silent. There is no space, no time to cover that space. The beginning and the ending are here of all things. There's really nothing that can be said about it. And then he says, the pressure and the strain have been going on quietly all day. Only now they have ceased. Now, these experiences of measurable vastness are not that uncommon in a spiritual experience, spiritual literature and teaching, but are usually seen as the vastness of awareness or of empty consciousness. But except for the pressure he is experiencing, that is unusual, usually. Later on, we find a different kind of experience he writes about. These are from his notebook, Krishnamurti notebook, the one I'm quoting. Woke up in the middle of the night with a sense of immense and measureless strength. It was not strength that will or desire has put together, but the strength that is there in a river, in a mountain, in a tree. So he's talking about not just the vastness, which is a common thing. Many people experience a vast emptiness or vast spaciousness, but he's talking about an immense strength, which will develop as we see in the next quote. The room became full with that benediction. Those kind of experiences he talks about, I'm talking about quoting, he calls it sometimes the benediction. Now, what followed is almost impossible to put down in words, he says. The profundity of it was not measurable. It was there, immovable, impenetrable, a solidity that was as light as the heaven. It was in the eyes and the breath. It was in the eyes and the eyes could see. There was impenetrable dignity and the peace that was the essence of all movement, action. There was love that was utterly perishable, and so it had the delicacy of all things, vulnerable, destructible, and yet it was beyond all this. It was there, imperishable, unnameable, the unknowing. When you read this, you sound like it is what people talk about non-dual experiencing, or it is similar to what many non-dual teachers say, but we should wait and see before we make this conclusion. But we know at first it was vastness, then a strength, now an immeasurable solidity. The next quote, in the same vein. One was aware of something utterly incorruptible, in which nothing could possibly exist that could become corrupt, deteriorate. It was too immense for the brain to grasp, to remember. With it all, there was that sense of power, strength, as solid as that mountain, which nothing could shatter, which no sacrifice, prayer, virtue could ever touch. Why should all this happen to us? No explanation is good enough. No one can invent a dozen. That's again from his notebook. In this experience, it is the other kind. There's one who is experiencing. There's a witness instead of no witness. So this thing that he called the solidity, the immensity, and the strength, he does not discuss in his talks, in his teachings. He found it in his diaries, which you wonder why not. He talks about observation, he talks about no mind, and no thought, but he never mentioned his own experience of solidity, immensity, strength, and so on, beside the vastness. And of course, in the last quote, he said, a solidity at the same time, it was light like a feather. And he didn't go further into what that means. You know, in my experience, solidity that is light as a feather is, I usually call it solid emptiness, the solidity of emptiness. One thing to see here, it's important note I'm making here. It's important to recognize that the vastness, the immensity, the strength, all the solidity are not recognized by him as his being or true nature, but as experience almost by a brain. He talks about the brain. By one experiences, one is, I mean, he doesn't say one is, one experiences or it is there by itself, but he never says it is him or it is his nature, which is quite different from non-dual teacher like Nisargadatta, who said, I am that, and he said, I am that solidity, immensity, impenetrability. Krishnamurti never talks about it as himself. There's always he or one there, observing, or sometimes gone. There is just that immense, solid vastness. Another thing characteristic of his experience so far is that it is not simply of one unchangeable truth, but has qualities. The qualities keep appearing in his experience, showing that the sacredness he witnessed is not one state or presence. There is a movable solidity, reminding us of the rock-like solidity in the Sargadatta, but also vulnerable, pure love. And he called it a benediction or sacredness. This fact that it has many qualities, that it's not just one thing, becomes clear in the next quote. It is strange that every experience state is utterly different. It is still the same movement, though it seems to change. It is still the changeless. Meaning it is the same truth, but this truth has different qualities, different forms. So it is not static, monolithic, like some of the Hindu talk about the Brahman and changing, always the same. He doesn't say that. He said it is always having qualities and love and innocence. Sometimes he talks about intelligence, immensity, solidity, strength, vastness. Another quote that illustrates these changes, which gives another experience of his that shows that a different thing he experiences. There was an intense bright light at the very center of the brain, and beyond the brain at the very center of consciousness of one's being. At the very center of consciousness was a bright light. With that light, there was present that incalculable strength and beauty beyond thought and feeling. Both the bright light, that as a center, and the immense solidity reminds us of things that talked about Nisargadatta. They were important for Nisargadatta, the bright point of light and the immense solidity are the two dimensions. You experience one that leads you to the other, which Nisargadatta called the absolute. Here, Krishnamurti doesn't recognize it as the absolute. I remember actually my own experience with Krishnamurti when I went to one of his talks. He came into a hall full of people, probably tens of thousands. He sat in the middle, and by him coming, there was some kind of spaciousness. He came in as a spacious openness, spacious awareness, although he doesn't talk about spacious awareness, but his state was spacious awareness. And he was talking at the time when he finally got to the main point, to the punchline. I saw a point of light appearing and descending right at the center of his heart. At the center of his heart was a brilliant point of light. He didn't say it. I don't think he even saw it. But he was aware at that time that he was being real, but also that was the truth. Although he didn't say, he was talking about the truth in general, but that made him feel the sense of realness of truth. Usually when I see a point of light in the heart of a human being, I know they have true realization, because recognizing the point, being the point of light, is the signature, at least in my teaching, that one knows what it means to be the spiritual nature. So he is being the spiritual nature here, although he never says he is. Again, another quote about the changes. Every time there is something new in this benediction, a new quality, a new perfume, but yet it is changeless. It is utterly unknowable. So it's not contradictory. It changes, but it's changeless. But that's easy to know when you have the experience of the changeability, but it is all the same. It is all pure consciousness, all pure presence, but with different qualities. I am bringing this up just to see that he had that recognition, which he enjoyed, which he saw it as beauty or sacredness of the beauty of the sacred, and that he has that openness, and he didn't see that as a problem, that it is both unchanging and changing at the same time. I go to another quote now. I came from his notebook. Out of this vast silence, suddenly, as one sat up in bed when thought was quiet and far away, when there wasn't even a whisper of a feeling, there came that which was now the solid, inexhaustible being. It was solid without weight, without measure. It was there, and besides it, there existed nothing. It was there without another. It's not possible to be one with it. It's not possible to be one with swiftly flowing river. You can never be one with that which has no form, no measure, no quality. It is, that is all. And again, it is the experience of just the fact of the solidity, no one being one with it. So it's not even non-dual or dual or anything like that. It is just the solidity. And he's not saying, I am the solidity, or one observing the solidity. One thing we observe here is that the solidity is not the silence, not the silence, vastness. It comes when there is the silence. Then the solidity comes. Where for Nisargadatta, the solidity and the silence are the same thing. Solidity is the solidity of silence. We go to another kind of realization he mentioned. As you see, there are many kinds of experiences, which is really what can happen when somebody has been transformed and is awakened. Doesn't mean they'll have the same experience all the time, although some teachers do experience things like that. They're always the pure consciousness. But here he's showing that no, life continues, that the spiritual nature has life. And for him, that was the intensity and the passion and the beauty of life. This quote: each moment reveals a new facet, a new depth, a new surface. You can't be all this at one moment, for each moment brings its own change. So if you are at all intelligent, you give up being anything. Notice that? You give up being anything. Most people miss that. But importantly, you give up being anything. Not being anything is a mysterious kind of realization, not mentioned in most spiritual teaching. One is not a self, but one also is not awareness or consciousness, because one is not anything. So not being anything means not being even consciousness or awareness. Because all the changes happening, there's no one, not being anything, and all these things just keep happening. Then now we come to the thing I want to get to, which is becomes his more dominant kind of experience. This quote starts with this: then there is only the fact and not the experiencing of the fact. That is one kind of observer is observed. With it came a movement of entering into unfathomable depths of intensity and of great bliss. And there was that otherness. It is important to recognize the word otherness. He is referring to the sacredness, the benediction, the immensity, the solidity, with its beauty and so on, but he refers at the otherness, which means there is him and there is the otherness. Which means he does not see this sacredness as what he is. It is an other, not his true self or nature. And he also does not see it as the nature of everything. Seeing the immensity or the vastness or the silence or the immeasurable otherness, or the love as the nature of everything, is one of the hallmarks of non-dual realization, but he does not get there. He doesn't do that. He doesn't say it's the nature of everything. He just sees it as something that happens. And all I had read in Krishnamurti's and talks I listened to, he never mentioned that he is experiencing his nature or the nature of reality. It is something that happens in the midst of reality. Here, in another quote about what he called the otherness. It was a day of the otherness. It went on quietly all day. At moments, it flared up, became very intense, and became quiet again, to go on quietly. It was there with such intensity that all movement became impossible. One was forced to sit down. Another quotation to illustrate more what he means by the otherness. There came the otherness, like a flash, and it remained for a while to be gone again. It's strange how very intense and actual it has become. It was as real as these rooftops with hundreds of chimneys. In it, there is a strange driving strength. Because of its purity, it is strong, the strength of innocency, which nothing can corrupt, and it is a benediction. So for him, the otherness, the sacredness, comes and goes. And even though it has all these qualities, he is a witness to it. And instead of being one, being it, or within him, which in most spiritual experiences, you experience that as within you, happening in you, or as you. He doesn't do it that way. It is always an otherness, which we will try to understand. What's that about? That is very characteristic, actually. Krishnamurti's inner experience, which he mentions in his notebook, and some of his biographers bring up, which he never talks about in his teaching. Again, most of the night, that blessing, that otherness was there. Though there was sleep, it was there. One felt it on waking. Strong, persistent, urgent, it was there, as though it had continued throughout the night. I mean, even during his sleep, the otherness was there in the room. Another quote, on several occasions it was there, with an all-embracing welcome of love, and it was quite incredible. Every time it had a new quality, a new beauty, a new austerity. So this otherness, which is sometimes called the sacred or the benediction, has many qualities, as I said. And he is frequently struck with its beauty, the beauty of these qualities, which is very different from many of the non-dual teachings, who do not really emphasize the qualities of the sacred. They mostly emphasize the awareness or the consciousness, or the infinity of the consciousness or awareness. But the various qualities and the beauty and all of that, even though it could be mentioned, they're not emphasized. For him, it's very important. It's part of the richness for him of spiritual awakening. So his life was full of beauty this way, as you see. And those experiences happening for him almost every day. The otherness continues to be the main and most frequently occurring experience, with its variations of delights, as we see in this quote. But on that road, meditation yielded to that otherness utterly silencing the already quiet brain. The brain was merely a passage from that immeasurable in a deep, wide river between steep banks. The strange otherness moved without direction, without time. You see here, there's the duality with the otherness, which disappears occasionally for him, as we see in some of the quote. Like it's usually he's the otherness, it's in the room, he's observing it, or it's just the otherness there. But sometimes you could see he connects it to his consciousness or his mind. He says, it wasn't just outside there in the room or on the terrace. It was inside and outside, but there was no division. It was something in which the whole mind and heart were caught up, and mind and heart ceased to be. That is getting closer to what people call non-dual realization. But he's talking here about the otherness. We see this development further in the next passage. Meditation was a movement in benediction. The movement flowed into the otherness, for it was, meaning this meditation, he meditates, and then the meditation sort of moves into the other, as sort of merges into the otherness. For it was there in the room, filling it and overflowing outward and beyond without end. There was in it a depth that was unfathomable, of such immensity, and there was peace. Here we see that the otherness has expanded, become almost boundless and infinite. In this next passage, we see him becoming more intimate with his otherness. And of a sudden, that unknowable immensity was there, not only in the room and beyond, but also deep in the innermost recesses, which was once the mind. It was the deepest recesses, what he called his mind. So this otherness, which he sees it as coming into the room, coming into the space, he was experiencing it now within him, as deep in the deepest recesses. Here now I want to bring in another quote, but from his biographer, Mary Lutin, who writes about the otherness, because the otherness, many at that time, because of his beginning with Theosophy, who believed he was being prepared to become a vehicle for some spiritual force that they call the Maitreya. I think it is an external presence, another being or some kind of external force that has nothing to do with him, that is coming to affect him or enter him or express itself through it. He was going to be a vehicle. Of course, he broke up with that whole view, but the idea is that there is something outside affecting him might make people think it might be similar to what the Theosophists believed, which is the otherness might be this outer force. So Mary Lutin asked him, I then asked him, do you ever feel being used, feel something coming into you? I wouldn't say that. It comes into the room when we are talking seriously, he says. Then she asked him, how is it related to the pain? I asked. Pain comes when I am quiet, not talking. It comes slowly until the body says, that's enough. Then she writes again, when we went into the matter again on this last occasion, she talked to him about that in 1980. Remember, he died in 1986. That he was very old by then, in his 80s. He seemed as eager as before to find out the truth about himself, and repeated that if Mary Zimbalist, which is one of his main friends and he was looking after him, Mary Zimbalist, and I could discover it, he would be able to corroborate it, but he could not, but he could tell us no more about what is this otherness. He writes, he could feel the other, but he did not seem to know what it was. From this, it would appear that the other was him, that he was not separate from it. But it also seemed that although it was always part of him, it was at times more present than at others. He said he could feel it in the room as if it were something that came from outside, always from the left. That's from her book, The Open Door. You see, it is like something coming from the left, as if it was something external coming from the outside into the room. I myself agree with Mary Lutjen, the biographer, that it is really him. It is not an external force outside. From the progression from his experiences and from what I know, I can discern of what he's talking about. That it is a manifestation of true nature, spiritual nature, but an unusual one, not that one that many people experience. One that is always changing, but staying itself. It manifests qualities, purifies his consciousness, shows him a teaching. He can expand endlessly to hold all of reality, but can't be a particular presence in his room. I think it is responsible for his unique or unusual kinds of realizations, which, as we have seen, he has many kinds, progressing from one thing to another and become focused on this otherness that has many qualities: immensity, love, beauty. He experienced it first dualistically as the watcher watching the immensity, but later on can be a watching without a watcher, but also made it possible for him to arrive at different kind of realizations, some non-dual, but most of them not so non-dual. We want to understand what it is. But to understand what it is will take us to parts of Krishnamurti's life he does not himself write about, and to understand what he calls his process that includes his excruciating pain, headache, and backache. What he called the process is the appearing of pain and pressure in his head that comes along somehow in connection with the otherness, with the experience of this benediction. So my question is, most people wonder, why is the pain? What is its meaning? What is behind it? He himself never knew. And the people around him did not understand, like Madame Annie Besant, who was his benefactor, who took care of him. She was the head of the Theosophical Society, and Ledbetter, who discovered him, who was a great psychic, who knew about his lifetime. All they didn't understand him, although they were training him to become the new vehicle for what's called, what they thought going to be the world teacher. Some thought it might be related to the Kundalini, which I'll talk about, but not his main theosophist trainers or teachers or friends. Here's a quote from his notebook about it. I think it is the quietness of the place, of the green slopes of the mountains, the beauty of the trees and the cleanliness, that and other things have made the pressure and the strain far greater. The head has been bad all day. It becomes worse when one is by himself. He's talking about himself. When one is by himself, he's not talking about anybody else. He's talking about himself. All last night it seemed to have been going on, and woke us several times shouting and groaning. Even during rest in the afternoon it was bad, and accompanied by shouting. To get that bad for him. He actually suffered from it. It was intense at the beginning, the first few years, but continued throughout his life, coming at certain times, all the way till the end. The timing of this pain, of this pressure, what we mean when it started and when it usually happened, we will use that, put it together with other information from his biographer about when it started, what kind of things happened to him, to have some understanding about what is the process, what is this pain, and how it is related to his experience of the otherness. Understanding this pain will help us understand his teaching more, why he does not mention his experiences that he writes about in his book, which I think could be very useful for his teaching, but he didn't mention them in his teaching. We will understand later on why. I will discuss that. We will also see that the process, the otherness, the process and the other, which is the process of pain, and the otherness, which is the sacredness, and his position in teachers and traditions, which he sort of disavowed, are all connected. This is a topic we want to focus on now. At least this is my understanding of Krishnamurti's situation. My understanding, I mean, might not be the truth, but that's how I understand him. Putting my experiences with what he reported from his experiences, what I understand of myself and him and spiritual reality in general, I will try to give some understanding of this whole mystery, which is really very unusual, very interesting. I mean, there have been other teachers, Bhagavad, who have a strange thing happening to him, but what happened to him here is unique to Krishnamurti. It is really his mystery, and it is, if we unlock the key of that mystery, we might understand something very important about him and what can happen in spiritual realization for some teachers, for some individuals. But first, we want to stress this kind of realization, that his experience is not usual for realized being. He experiences the sacred as otherness, which means not as himself or his being. At the beginning, it is more dualistic, as I said, in the sense that there is Krishnamurti and there is the sacred immensity in the room, and even others in the room can sometimes feel this immensity, this immense presence, or immense stillness in the room that comes and goes. Later, the immensity expands and fills the valley and so on. Sometimes he mentioned that it is also in his head, and later in his heart and mind. At a later date, it expands to include everything. But even when he writes that it includes everything, he never mentioned that it is the nature of everything, which is part of awakening of non-dual teachings, which are the highest teachings on earth, is that when one awakens, many people, these days non-duality is very common in Dzogchen, Mahamudra, and Veda Vedanta, and Ibn Arabi, teaching the Sufi, is that when then there is true awakening, we recognize that the sacred, which can be experienced in different ways, as consciousness, awareness, or presence, is not includes everything. It is the nature of everything. In fact, everything is nothing but the expression of that sacredness or that sacred presence. But he never mentioned that it is the nature of everything. Sometimes he says everything is in it or part of it, but he never says it is everything. It is the nature of everything. And he never says it is what I am. It is my nature. So it continues to be somewhat dualistic, somewhat an other. So that's the point why he calls it the otherness or the other, which is an unusual way to talk about spiritual experience. Because spiritual experience is to realize what you are, to understand. And he talks about understanding oneself, and it's very important for him to understand one's experience, oneself. That is the whole thing about his mode of inquiry, which uses intense and focused observation. But he doesn't see this as himself. Or if he did, he doesn't write about it. As I said, it's unusual for realized beings to experience the sacred as otherness. It is only seen this way in theistic traditions, actually. In theistic tradition, who believe in God or deity, it can be seen as outside, as something as other, where the sacred and divine is other than oneself. Now, to understand this, we need to go back to the beginning of his experience, beginning of his awakening, which Mary Lutyens, in the Years of Awakening, that's the first of his book, first of his biography, she talks about the beginning of his awakening, when he was still with the Theosophist, being trained by them, prepared for him to become a vehicle for this sacred force that they called the Maitreya. But the Maitreya is an interesting thing. They use the Maitreya because Maitreya is really a figure in Buddhism. Maitreya is supposed to be the next Buddha. The last Buddha was Gautama Buddha, Sakyamuni, which was 2,500 years ago. And according to the Buddhist mythology, Buddhist beliefs, the next Buddha, which could be Maitreya, was going to be in another 2,500 years, because there are 5,000 years between Buddhas. But here, the Theosophists thought they could bring in the Maitreya, and Krishnamurti become the vehicle for the Maitreya. They were preparing for him. It's not like the Maitreya is appearing. No, preparing Krishnamurti to be a vehicle for the Maitreya. But so he was in the context of that view when his first experiences happened. Here Krishnamurti writes, after the experiences first in 1920, 21. Then on the 17th of August, I felt acute pain at the nape of my neck, and I had to cut down my meditation to 15 minutes, which meaning he was doing meditation longer than that. The pain, instead of getting better as I had hoped, grew worse. The climax was reached on the 19th of August of that year. In the same account, after having some unusual experiences, he writes, Mr. Warrington, who was there, one of the people in Ojai, asked me to go under the pepper tree, which is near the house. Pepper tree became very famous in his life because that's when he had his main realization. There I sat thus for some time. I felt myself going out of my body. I saw myself sitting down with the delicate, tender leaves of the tree over me. I was facing the east. In front of me, that means he left his body, which is sort of sometimes that happens to some people, that they have their realization. I was facing the east. In front of me was my body, and over my head I saw the star bright and clear. That's why his order is called the Order of the Star. Seeing the star is a big deal for the Theosophist. He was seeing the star above his head. Then I could feel the vibrations of the Lord Buddha. I beheld Lord Maitreya and Master KH, that's Master Kuthumi, one of the main masters of the Theosophists. So he was still in that realm, seeing these things, experiencing these things. I was happy, calm, and at peace. There was such profound calmness, both in the air and within myself, the calmness of the bottom of a deep and fathomable lake. Like the lake, I felt my physical body, with its mind and emotions, could be ruffled on the surface, but nothing, nay, nothing, disturbed the calmness of my soul. The presence of the mighty beings was with me for some time, and then they were gone. I was supremely happy, for I had seen nothing could ever be the same. I have drunk at the clear and pure waters at the source of the fountain of life, and my thirst was appeased. The fountain of truth has been revealed to me, and the darkness has been dispersed. This is from the years of awakening. This was actually the definitive turning point in his life. It's possibly what he called mutation, or at least what started what he called mutation, which is the sudden, complete change of his being or his experience or his life. So this experience started what he called the process which started around it, a little before it, during it, and after it. But it was very much connected with that experience. And his process with the pain will vary according to circumstances, as this quote says. His process was continuing all the time he was traveling. He was in constant pain, with throbbing and burning at the nape of the neck and the base of the spine. You see, to understand this, it's important. Nape of the neck, right to the occiput, and at the base of the spine. Why is that? I mean, that should be clear to the Ledbetter, who was writing about, chakras, Kundalini, all of that. It's commonly known, but for some reason they missed it. So my understanding is that both his awakening experience and his process and his pain can be viewed as the effects or results of the Kundalini, of the opening and the rising of the Kundalini. For two of its main three blockages are the base of the spine and the nape of the neck. Usually, the Kundalini is seen to pass through three gates. First gate is the sacrum, which is the bottom of the spine. Second gate is behind the diaphragm. Third gate is behind the neck, at the base of the skull. These are the main gate, the main blockages, which have all kinds of psychological, all kind of physical, emotional blockages. And there's a Kundalini has to go through all of these to go all the way at the top of the head and bring about clarity and awakening and all kind of experiences. The following passage illustrates why I think it is the Kundalini that was arriving in the 27th of February of 1921. Whatever it is, the force that he writes, whatever it is, the force, or whatever one calls the Bali thing, came up my spine, up to the nape of my neck, and then separated into two, one going to the right and the other to the left of my head, till they met between the two eyes, just above my nose. You see, they rose up and they went to the eyes. They didn't go all the way up top of his head. Why? Something prevented the Kundalini from going all the way up to the neck. Or if it goes all the way up to the top of the head, it can appear as a vastness of light, or the vastness of awareness, which is oneself, or it can appear as the bejeweled head of a cobra, which is the completion of the Kundalini. And again, he writes, what I think is Mary Lutyens, as Krishnamurti told Besant in a letter from Washington on May 23, he was worried about his physical condition. His process was continuing all the time. He was traveling. He was in constant pain, with throbbing and burning at the nape of his neck and in the base of his spine, which means the first gate and the third gate. It was encountering some difficulty. Otherwise, why would there be pain? When there's no difficulty, no blockage, it is a clear passage. Will pass through. Will pass with delight, with pleasure, with ecstasy, with light, or with presence. However, I don't attribute all of it to the Kundalini, because that is not completely explained, and that is also, there's something about my own experience that tells me there is something more to it. An experience of the other that I will mention. But I think before I go into the more interesting, really amazing thing, and that help us understand him, let's take a 5-minute break. You could rest, go to the bathroom, stuff like that. Take 5 minutes and be back in 5 minutes. Okay? We'll continue trying to understand Krishnamurti as an amazing human being. So what I wanted to say, besides the Kundalini, to account for what he called his process, the headaches and all of that, is that the Kundalini is one force. There is another force known spiritual teaching, which is called the descending force. Kundalini is the ascending force. Descending force is experiencing the spiritual light, spiritual coming down from above into the head, and coming down and going through the body and exposing the obstacle and barriers and understanding them until it clarifies the body and consciousness. And that way one embodies that sacredness. One is the sacredness. I know this because I've had the same process. I had the headache myself. I had a headache, I remember, for a year or two. That continuous, wouldn't go away. I talked to many yogis. I saw yogis, a lot of men. Most of them didn't understand it, didn't know what they thought was physical, but it didn't go away. Until I started experiencing and knowing things about it. I was a headache around the head mostly. I didn't have it at the bottom here because I didn't have an issue with the Kundalini. My obstacle that had to do with the descending, what I call a descending force. I had to understand some psychological barriers before the headache stopped. But they stopped only by the psychological barriers and also by the appearance of what is called the descending force. I mean, as the psychological barriers are understood, remove the headache, then something descend, and that's the recognition of the descending force, as the descending light or descending presence that fills the consciousness. The descending force was discussed by Aurobindo, one of the Indian teachers in the last century. I had to work through it for the whole body and consciousness to be clarified and purified. It led to the embodiment of the sacred, the embodiment of the immensity as one own nature and being. That was for myself. But let me give you a quote from, not for me, because from somebody well known in the last century, which is Ramana Maharshi, who had something similar. Ramana Maharshi described it as his self as force or current, which descended on him in his death experience. His experience, he felt he died, he lay down, he felt dead, he left his body, and he looked, and then he recognized himself as different from the body. That was the beginning of his realization. And what he talks about is a force or current, a center of energy playing on the body, continuing regardless of the rigidity or activity of the body, though existing in connection with this. He says it was that current, force, or center that constituted myself, that kept me acting and moving, but this was the first time I came to know it. I had no idea at that time of the identity of that current with the personal God or Ishvara, as I used to call him. It was only feeling that everything was being done by the current and not by me. This current, or he called it Efficacy, now felt as if it was myself, not a superimposition, not something superimposed or entering me as the Theosophical Society that Maitreya will superimpose itself in Krishnamurti. That Efficacy continues right until now. That's what Ramana Maharshi said. So it is not an otherness, it is himself, but it was made things happen for him. It is clear the spiritual force appeared to him as something that descended into him and transformed him and became his true self. He did not have much pain or resistance to it. To give you a quote from Krishnamurti or from one of his biographers that shows that it is a force that goes into the body and that becomes one's presence, here's a quote from Pupil Jakar, that's one of his biographers, was his friend. When the process was operating, the body lying on, and the process means the pain, the intensity was operating. The body, that's the Krishna body, was lying on the bed, appeared the shell. Only a body consciousness appeared to be present. In this state, the voice was frail, childlike. That means Krishnamurti's voice. Then suddenly the body filled with the soaring presence. Krishnaji, which was the name she gave to him, would sit up cross-legged, his eyes closed, the fragile body would appear to grow, and his presence will fill the room. There was a palpable, throbbing silence and immense strength that poured into the room and enveloped us. But for them, she, Pupil, and the other there who would witness him, because Krishnamurti was sort of at the beginning like he was unconscious because of the pain, then he woke up, but they felt it as his presence. So in this case, it's clear that he became like an empty shell first for the descent to happen. And then he was embodying the fullness of presence that filled the room, instead of the presence being an otherness in the room. But remember here, he had to become like a child first for the presence to be in him instead of outside. So what does that mean? My understanding is that Krishnamurti had some psychological obstacle issues, hidden concepts or beliefs, not thought, but hidden and conscious, that created a blockage around his head and also at the base of his spine. This is bound to block both the Kundalini and the descending force, which is a very powerful force of true nature, more powerful than Kundalini and has far greater consequences. My headaches were due to psychological blockages that had in them doubts, beliefs, ideas, content from the past that I was not aware of and had not worked through. Working through it made the headache go away for myself. It is interesting to talk about Krishnamurti that way. Because Krishnamurti, he keeps talking about being a state of silence where there are no thoughts. He said there's no thoughts, and there's witnessing or observation with no thoughts, and no observer, no self. There is just what is experienced. In this case, for instance, the sacredness. But then it is an otherness, not him. What is this duality? How can this duality be there if there are no beliefs, no unconscious concepts? And why would there be headache? Why would be such pain? You see, if you take it from the perspective of the Theosophy, they will say, well, the master are working on him. That's how many they're working on him, purifying his nervous system so that he can embody the spiritual force, the Maitreya. But if they were working, why won't they do it in bliss? Why pain? If they're that powerful. Pain indicates blockage, usually, indicates an obstruction. And he knew there was something going on, but he never understood it. So what kind of strong unconscious belief or idea created such blockage to both Kundalini and descending force, in his case, with the resulting and remitting pain? Some we might never know, for some must have been there from the beginning of his process. Some we might be able to see from later developments and direction of his teaching. For instance, to try to connect this, what he called the process and the pain, and with the otherness, with his teaching. He always taught the authority not to be relied on or trusted, spiritual authority, that no external teacher or teaching can be of any use, that one has to rely totally on oneself, that no teaching or tradition can be of help. He took it from the beginning till he died. He held on this view and made it central to his teaching till his death. And it is obvious from the videos of his his talks later in his life that he became more and more rigid and fixated on this view. If you want to see him being fixated on that view, watch the video of him dialoguing with Chogyam Trungpa, the Buddhist meditation master. It was a video. I was surprised actually when I saw it. I was watching it, and there was supposed to be a dialogue about meditation. And because they're both Trungpa, the meditation master, and Krishnamurti talks about meditation. And for Krishnamurti, meditation means something specific, which is probably different than Trungpa thinks about it. But in this dialogue, it is not really a dialogue. It's mostly Krishnamurti lecturing Trungpa. And in fact, not only lecturing, talking at him. Krishnamurti is known as somebody who listens, knows how to listen. But if you really study the listening, he listens, he intently listens, but what he responds as if had nothing to do with what he listened to. He comes in with his own perspective. So that shows me there was a fixation and this belief that no authority, no spiritual authority can be of any help. You can only find the truth only by yourself, which many people these days rely on him so that you can find your own path. Cause of headache. Do you want to have that headache all of your life to find your own path? That dialogue was in 1972 with Trungpa. The interesting thing, I was thinking, if he was really curious, if it was a dialogue, and he knows this guy here is a Tibetan master of meditation, and he is the product of a lineage. spiritual lineage, he would have asked him. He's very curious. He wants to find the truth. I wonder, I was waiting for him to ask Trungpa, hey, Trungpa, what did you learn? You're supposed to be a product of a lineage. Did you learn to be free? What did you learn that is real? He never asked. I thought that would be the opportunity to find out for himself firsthand whether the spiritual lineage can be of any help. Here's a meditation master, supposed to be the product, a speaker for a lineage, and he wouldn't ask him any question. He wasn't curious about Trungpa's experience. Trungpa managed to put in a few words here and there. He was smart. He sort of acknowledged when he agreed with him, but he didn't have much time because Krishnamurti was kept talking. Now, this idea that lineages don't work, that spiritual teachings don't help you to realize yourself, has some truth, obviously. Spiritual teaching know that. Spiritual teaching know that at some point in the process for any path, the spiritual realization has to be your own. You have to recognize yourself independent from any influences, even if the influences of the teaching you are following. Like even if you're following a path of teaching, you have to forget all about it because you have to forget the mind. You have to forget all mind and thought. It's a stage of the path where that happens, because you have to be free from the influences of the mind. Influences of the mind include influences of all other all things you have learned, all your paths, including any teaching, to recognize yourself in the pure aloneness of your and intimacy of your consciousness. That is true. But that doesn't mean spiritual teaching are not useful in terms of practices, guidance, support, before, during that aloneness, and afterward, because that is only one stage. He took that one stage, he made it the whole path. But the thing that one thing we can see, one belief that's unconscious for him, he thought it was truth, which is the belief that what he called, he said, truth is a pathless path. It is true at the time of awakening. However, there are all these paths. And their work, they produce great teachers, great masters, enlightened being, like Nisargadatta, like Shankara, like Atmananda, like many of the Tibetan masters, the great masters, Dalai Lama, so what he took to be his teaching, obviously not true, at least not completely true. Now, if you believe something that is not true and believe it strongly, it will create something in you, in your nervous system, that is an obstacle, that is a blockage, that is actually a physical tension that is bound to be a barrier to the spiritual force, to the spiritual light, to the spiritual presence. And I think that can cause a great deal of pain and headaches. It was that way for me, but I worked through it. I managed to have enough guidance to work through it, to understand it. Krishnamurti values truth, verified by direct experience. So how does he know that teachers and teaching can't be of help, right? How did he know? He only observed his own experience. If he really wanted to know whether teaching, tradition can be of help or not, he could have talked to Ramana Maharshi. He was there in India. He could have talked to Atmananda, Nisargadatta, found out from them. Well, how did they learn? And does it learn? Is their gurus? Nisargadatta's guru had no use. Nisargadatta said it was from his guru that he became realized. Why didn't he go and talk to people like Nisargadatta? And there were all those great Tibetan masters who were there in India around the time Krishnamurti was in India. He could have had, in the West, he could have talked to Idris Shah in London, who was one of the main Naqshbandi Sufis. He could have talked to Gurdjieff, who was there in Paris and New York. He didn't bother to talk to any of those spiritual authorities, but he continues teaching spiritual authority is no good. Don't listen to them. I think holding so tightly and completely to such mental view, which obviously was unconscious to him as a mental view, for he frequently experienced no thoughts, must have had consequences like the blockage of the immense energy that was attempted to go through him, and because it couldn't go through him, it has to appear outside him. And he called it the otherness. Now, so what are the roots of this belief, of the question of authority? Part of it must have been something there with him from the beginning. If you notice, if you explore his biography, his life, I'm going to run out of time, but I have to give the full story before we get into the questions. Hopefully we'll have some time for some of them. Is that at the beginning of his life, when he was working with a theosophist, he was very obedient, he was very good, he was very compliant. But later on, he went against them, he opposed them, he threw out the whole theosophy thing, and he threw out all spiritual lineages and traditions and rituals and all of that. And I think a lot of it makes sense, because many things do become rigid beliefs and ideas and all that. You do want to throw it away. But he threw away the baby with the bathwater, which led to his particular kind of experience. He had great, the descending force was so powerful that still manifested for him into many kinds of spiritual experiences. He had many kinds of realization, but it was through transcending the barrier instead of working through it. That's how I understand it. The spiritual force transcended the barrier and appeared as an otherness, and that purified his consciousness, led to many realization experiences, like his kind of observer, not the observed. Another barrier, I think one of the other barrier that I think he had unconsciously, that he wasn't aware of or didn't discuss, is that his original experience of awakening under the pepper tree, it happened in the middle of his training by the Theosophist. Many of the Theosophists were there. And so he was trained, and his Kundalini arose, woke up in the midst of that training. He was being trained, he was being taught for years, he was prepared. And so his Kundalini can very easily be seen as having to do with that intense training that he was going through. Meaning, he learned by being trained. He learned from other teachers. His awakening happened because of other teachers. So for him to say, come and say, no, it's not from other, you can't depend on other teachers, he was contradicting his own experience. He was teaching something to his students that wasn't true about himself. Another thing is that he had a debt to the Theosophist teacher like Annie Besant and Ledbetter. Instead of feeling the debt to them and this, for his realization, not debt that he took care of it, he felt the debt of taking care of him and financially, physically, all of that, but he didn't see the debt to them in the sense of his own spiritual awakening. And not to acknowledge that debt will create a great deal of blockage, a great deal of obstacle. Of course, the authority is an authority issue, which appears sometimes as a compliance, sometimes an opposition and rebellion. So at the beginning of his life, he was compliant, and during that experience, after his experience, he became, threw away the theosophy, he became more the opposing kind. I have more notes about to understand more the reason for his opposition to authority, but let's leave that. We have enough. Now, the efficacy of his teaching. That's another important thing that relates to all of this. It did not occur to me to wonder whether his teaching was effective, whether it produced in some the change he talked about, that he wanted people to change. And he said it's possible to change, and he taught for 50, 60 years, till I read his own questioning of it. First of all, nobody is known to have awakened from Krishnamurti teaching, to have experiences, not necessarily of the otherness, but of the sacredness, of the pure beauty, and the experience of no thoughts during silence for many hours. It didn't happen. He himself said it. And that's what made me think, oh, he himself recognized that nobody was able to change the way he thought people can change. He actually thought sometimes there was something about him that's different. He even called himself a freak. I must be some kind of freak. And that is one reason some of his followers didn't want to publish some of the things he wrote, because they thought if he is a freak, then that means he's different. Why is he teaching those other people? Those other people are not going to get it, because there's something unusual physically about him that made him be capable of such experience, such kind of transformation. Here's a quote. Just before his death, people were asking about death, whatever, if he goes, what happened. He says, when he goes, it goes. There's no consciousness left behind of that consciousness, I mean, the immensity, or that state. They'll all pretend or try to imagine they can get into touch with that. Perhaps they will, or somewhat. They will somewhat if they live the teaching, but nobody has done it. Nobody. And so that's that. That's from Religion's Open Door. There's a quote from another biographer, his cook, that is very clear. He said, just before his death, he writes, he also made it clear that in his eyes, nobody had any inkling of the immensity of what he had happened, stressing repeatedly that no one around him, nor in the world at large, had understood what he had been talking about. I mean, he acknowledged that nobody understood him. I mean, my understanding is that people didn't understand him because he had a closed system in some sense. His way of practicing is that you need to observe without thought. But how do you get to the state of being to observe without thought? He said there's no method, no teaching. And then he talks about this and he doesn't give a how. So as a result, of course, people learn how to observe, learn about the importance of no attachment, and you have to look at the inner, all of that. But nobody has gone through what he called the transformation, the mutation, where when you're really open for the spiritual universe to reveal itself to you in all its secret. I mean, his situation was unusual. To have extended period of no thoughts, silence with no thoughts, is unusual even for realized beings. So there was something unusual about him that that allowed him that possibility. He talks about he had a vacuity since he was a child. His mind was vacuous. And even his friends thought he was an idiot because he couldn't think. And I think that's vacuity. He thinks this is important for his later transformation, which I think is useful. It did help him to be in the state of no thoughts. But also, it didn't help him in terms of because he couldn't remember because his memory was very bad all the time, most of the time. So he couldn't put something he experienced at one time to something experienced to another time and put them in an overall arching insight. He didn't do that. His insight was always in the moment, what is there, which is very important in spiritual understanding and teaching. But spiritual teaching can include insight from other times. But he did not value that, and I don't think he had the capacity to do that, partly because maybe of that vacuity he was talking about. Now, what is this otherness he was talking about? That is changes but doesn't change. It's an immensity which has qualities, joy, and all of that. Most of the authors will think maybe it is the Maitreya or Master Kuthumi. But some of the Theosophists, like Ariel Sanat in his biography called The Inner Life Krishnamurti, thought it is most likely the expression of the eternal spirit, which is what I think. What manifests through nature that can be changing without changing, manifesting many qualities, still being itself, and making possible many kind of realization not known by most teachings, which can appear in the room and not necessarily from within one's consciousness, and is not simply the vastness of silence or infinity of pure awareness, but can appear when there is silence and silence and vastness. I myself could see it in him sometime in his talk, in his videos. He talks from it, but at those time, I'm not sure whether he's aware he's talking from it. This kind of manifestation through nature is included in some path. Some paths discuss it. It's rare, not all paths know it. It's a particular manifestation of true nature. It's a possibility that can cleanse the mind and purify the consciousness and reveal teaching and realization. It is a particular that can be the whole, or the whole that appears as a particular. He saw it as outside of himself. Now the teaching, it is an inner arising. Anyway, understanding Krishnamurti show us that, first of all, one can be realized, he was realized, he was awakened, he had all kinds of immense experiences, but he also has hidden concepts, even in the state of no thoughts, there were hidden concepts. The fact that there is no conscious thought doesn't mean there are no unconscious concepts and beliefs, which obviously he had, which created the kind of juxtaposition and configuration of his experience, in my view. This is my view. But whatever accounted for his experience, we must not forget his gift. He had experiences that revealed true nature in such variety and realized in many ways. I think this is his gift to spirituality. Not his teaching, which many teaching actually have, a teaching of just witnessing without a witness, without doing anything, just letting it be. That is part of many teaching, like Dzogchen or Kashmiri Shaivism. But his kind of experiences, he himself, and the kind of experiences, the variety, he showed the varieties of realizations, not just non-dual. He experienced non-dual and talked about it without calling it non-dual, but he had all kinds of other things, like the fact, just the fact, ma'am. I think it's very useful to understand Krishnamurti, spirituality for one's path. That it is possible to be realized and still have unconscious belief. And I'm trying to say it's not just, he's illustrative for most teachings. Most teachers are actually like that. There can be awakening, but there can be still unconscious belief and concept. Although people say it's non-conceptual, doesn't mean there are no hidden concepts. But still, even in that, Krishnamurti had a free, wonderful life, enjoyable, enjoyed beauty, enjoyed depth, profundity. He broke many molds that many spiritual tradition teachers had believed necessary, and had showed there is more to spiritual experience of the sacred than just non-dual realization or silent vastness of awareness. Okay, it's time for questions.
All right. There are many beautiful questions.
I'm sure there are many. I'm sorry that we don't have much time. I actually had to delete many things I didn't say. It would have taken me longer.